The thing that bothered me the most was I had all my music and I left it behind and I said, don't use my music. And of course they did.
From interviews, Dave Mustaine seems like a rock legend who moved past old grudges, but behind the scenes tensions have been building. And now there are reports that he has completely exploded about former bandmate James Hetfield, and we should have seen it coming from the decades of simmering resentment. And a paperwork can say their feud has been festering for nearly 40 years. To him casually saying in the past, "I've made my peace with it." The details coming in from his shocking new interview are wild, and we might be dealing with metal's most explosive rivalry finally erupting. This story keeps on getting more intense, so I'ma put you up to speed. Dave Mustaine's explosive interview stunned fans when what was supposed to be routine promotion for Megadeath's 40th anniversary crushed the world. Tour turned into a full-blown takedown of James Hetfield. According to Trench's News, the legendary Megadeth frontman has finally unleashed his full, unfiltered truth after decades of being portrayed as the bitter ex-bandmate. In a paperwork can say the revelation have completely shattered the fragile peace between metal's biggest rivals. He didn't hold back, and I think the situation is messy because it's devastating. It ain't just another metal feud. I mean, hearing Mustaine finally expose what he calls 40 years of Metallica's revisionist is pretty wild. Some would even say long overdue. Although there's a lot of people who believe that Mustaine has talked too much about his Metallica over the years and possibly facing criticism for reopening old wounds. However, reports surfaced from the Metal Hammer interview showing that the breaking point came when the interviewer asked about Megadeth's evolution over 4 decades. Another witness revealed that what followed was 40 years of frustration finally boiling over, as Mustaine declared, "Look, I've been painted as the bitter ex-member for 4 decades, while James Lars and their PR machine rewrote history. Every interview, every documentary, every book, they've been telling their sanitized version, and I've been labeled the bad guy just for speaking my truth. I'm done with half-truths and diplomatic answers." The roots of this legendary feud stretch back to 1981, when Metallica was formed in Los Angeles. Sources familiar with the early days reveal that Mustaine's technical skill and aggressive playing helped define the band's early sound, shaping what would become thrash metal. According to Mustaine's new account, "We were creating something revolutionary together. But there's a narrative that I was just some out-of-control drunk who got kicked out for being too old. The reality? We were all drinking, all partying. It was the early 80s metal scene, but I was the only one held accountable, while the others got to rewrite their wild years into some responsible bandleader mythology." This directly challenges Metallica's long-held narrative about his firing in April 1983 as they prepared to record their first album, Kill 'Em All. What makes this story especially explosive is how Mustaine directly challenged Hetfield's character and contributions to early Metallica. James has spent decades presenting himself as this stoic leader who had to make the tough choice to fire me for the good of the band. The truth? He was insecure about my playing and songwriting from day one. There were power struggles happening constantly, and when they got the chance to replace me with someone less threatening, they took it. Mustaine claims that internal band documents and testimonies from early scene members would back his version of events. Ask anyone who was there in the beginning. Ask the people at the shows. Ask the other bands. We all know what really went down. The timeline of events, according to Mustaine, suggests that his departure from Metallica was far more calculated than previously acknowledged. They had already auditioned Kirk. They had already made the decision weeks before they actually told me, and they waited until we were 3,000 miles from home in New York to do it, handing me bus ticket back to California. That wasn't about my behavior. That was about making sure I couldn't fight back or immediately start something new to compete with them. After forming Megadeath, Mustaine channeled his anger into creating music that would challenge Metallica technically and commercially. For 4 decades, the two bands developed on parallel paths, creating a rivalry that helped define thrash metal. Longtime metal journalist Don Kay, who covered both bands since their earliest days, provides context. The Metallica-Mustaine split was seismic, not just for those involved, but for the entire evolution of thrash metal. Without that firing, we might never had Megadeath, and the entire metal landscape would look different. These guys pushed each other creatively for decades, each trying to outdo the other with every album. That competition gave us some of the greatest metal ever recorded from both bands, but it came at the cost of a friendship that never healed. Songwriting credits remain the most contentious issue. Between Mustaine and Megadeth's founder, presented what he claims is definitive evidence that his contributions to Metallica's early albums were far more substantial than the band has ever acknowledged. Pull up the No Life Till Leather demo and compare it to Kill 'Em All. You'll hear entire song structures I created, not just a few riffs. The Four Horsemen? That was my song The Mechanics. Slowed down with a new middle section, Metal Militia. Jump in the Fire Phantom Lord. I wrote the majority of those tracks. They've spent 40 years minimizing my role while building their empire, partly on my creative work. Mustaine revealed that the financial impact of these disputed songwriting credits has been substantial. We're talking about songs that have generated millions in revenue over 4 decades. I've watched songs I wrote, significant parts of, become Metallica classics, played in stadiums, while I got a fraction of what I deserved for my creative work. According to music industry experts, the streaming era has only amplified these disparities. In today's catalog-focused music business, these classic metal tracks generate significant revenue across platforms, explains Billboard analyst Jim Asker. The difference between being credited as a primary songwriter versus a contributor can literally mean millions of dollars, especially for tracks that have maintained cultural relevance for 40 years. Former metal scene insiders have begun corroborating parts of Mustaine's account. Metal historian Martin Popoff commented, "If you listen to the early demos with Dave and compare them to the final recordings, it's clear his contributions were substantial." The Metallica version of events has always been that they simply used a few of his riffs, but the evidence suggests his involvement in the songwriting was much deeper. The financial stakes of these disagreements are enormous. Over 40 years, those early albums have sold millions of copies, with disputed tracks becoming staples of Metallica's live shows and generating significant royalties. Music industry analysts estimate the combined catalog value of Metallica and Megadeth at over $500 million, with disputed songs accounting for tens of millions in potential royalties. Mustaine's explosive interview also addressed the personal toll of being expelled from what would become one of music's biggest success stories. People don't understand what it does to you psychologically to help create something get pushed out and then watch it become a global phenomenon. I had to rebuild from scratch while they took what we started to heights none of us could have imagined. Do I respect what they accomplished? Absolutely. But have they acknowledged what they took from me? Never properly. This raw emotional honesty surprised even longtime Megadeth fans, who had grown accustomed to Mustaine's more measured public statements about Metallica in recent years. What pushed Mustaine to finally unleash his unfiltered truth after decades of measured responses? Industry insiders point to several converging factors. Dave has reached a point in his career where he has nothing to lose, observes one longtime Megadeth associate who requested anonymity. He's survived cancer, serious arm injuries, lineup changes. He's stared death in the face. If not now, when? Hetfield's recent interviews about Metallica's legacy may have been another catalyst, with what Mustaine perceived as subtle digs about the band's early days. There's been a pattern where James rewrites history in a way that minimizes Dave's contributions. Notes one veteran metal journalist. Those subtle jabs accumulate over time. The sudden change in Mustaine's approach became evident when he began addressing specifically what triggered his breaking point. I recently read an interview where James talked about the early songwriting as if it was primarily him and Lars. "I've tolerated a lot over the years, but completely erasing my creative contributions? That crosses a line. These weren't riff ideas I brought to the table. These were fully structured songs that became the foundation of their career." That level of historical revisionism demands a response. The Megadeath founder proceeded to detail specific songs, track by track, outlining exactly what elements he had written and how they appeared in the final Metallica versions. The emotional toll of this decades-long feud was revealed in Mustaine's candid discussion. People think I'm obsessed with Metallica, but they don't understand what it's like to help create something revolutionary, only to be pushed out, and then watch it become one of the biggest bands in history. Mustaine said, "I built Megadeath into something I'm incredibly proud of. But every interview for 40 years has included questions about Metallica. Every achievement has been measured against theirs. How would anyone feel?" Mustaine spoke openly about how the ongoing comparisons affected him personally. "For decades I've heard, Dave would have been in Metallica if only he could control himself. While those guys became heroes for overcoming the same addictions and behaviors I had. That double standard has been maddening." Mustaine revealed previously unknown details about the night before his firing. "What really happened was, James got physically aggressive with me after drinking. I defended myself, and suddenly I'm labeled the violent one. That incident became the excuse they needed. Lars had been pushing to replace me for weeks. They already had Kirk waiting in the wings. It wasn't some spontaneous decision based on my behavior. It was a calculated move to reshape the band with more compliant members who wouldn't challenge Lars and James for control." These specific allegations about Hetfield's behavior contradict the carefully crafted image the Metallica frontman has maintained, and help explain why Mustaine feels the historical record needs correction. The Megadeath founder also revealed that there had been attempts at reconciliation over the years that ultimately failed. "When we did the big 4 shows, there was a moment I thought maybe we'd moved past it. But then interviews would come out with subtle digs, or their documentary would present the same one-sided version of events." Mustaine claimed that critical conversations happened backstage during those shows that the public never witnessed. "James actually admitted to me privately that things didn't go down exactly as they've portrayed for all these years. But publicly, the same old narrative continued. They need me to be the villain in their story. It's too late to change it now." Perhaps most surprising was Mustaine's revelation about behind-the-scenes communication in recent years. "After James went to rehab in 2019, we had a brief exchange that I thought might lead to healing. He reached out, acknowledged some hard truths about the past, and seemed genuinely interested in clearing the air. I responded openly and honestly. Then silence, nothing came of it. Months later, I heard him interviews right back to the same old narrative about being too wild to keep in the band while presenting himself as someone who had courageously faced his demons. Why reach out privately only to continue the public mythology? That kind of duplicity is what finally pushed me to speak the whole unfiltered truth." Hetfield's response to Mustaine's interview came via an official Metallica statement, which read in part, "We're disappointed to see Dave reopening old wounds that were healing. We've all acknowledged his important early contributions to Metallica and have made peace with the past. The band wishes Dave and Megadeth continued success and hope someday we can all celebrate our shared metal legacy rather than relitigate events from 40 years ago." Industry observers noted the careful diplomatic wording, which avoided addressing any specific claims made by Mustaine. Metallica's manager reportedly instructed band members not to comment further, creating what some see as a strategic silence. The contrast between Metallica's measured response and Mustaine's detailed allegations wasn't lost on industry observers. It's the classic approach they've always taken, notes public relations consultant Rebecca Winters, who has worked with multiple metal acts. Make a brief, dignified statement that positions Dave as dwelling on the past while they focus on the future. It's effective PR, but it doesn't address any of the specific claims. It simply dismisses them as old news. This approach has worked for 40 years, so why change now? The problem is that social media has changed how these narratives spread. With Mustaine giving specific, verifiable details about songs and events, fans can actually investigate and draw their own conclusions. The metal community's reaction to Mustaine's revelations has been divided, with fans and musicians taking sides in a debate that spans generations. Megadeth fans have rallied around hashtags like #JusticeForDave and #TheTruthIsOut, while Metallica supporters question Mustaine's timing and motivations. Anthrax's Scott Ian, who performed alongside both bands in the Big Four shows, expressed disappointment. As someone who loves both bands, it's hard to see these wounds reopened. Those Big Four shows felt like closure for the whole scene. We were celebrating thrash together, not tearing each other down. Lamb of God's Randy Blythe took a more philosophical view. Every band from my generation was influenced by both Metallica and Megadeth. They're both foundational. This isn't just their story, it's part of all our stories in heavy music. Megadeth's current drummer Dirk Verbeuren publicly supported Mustaine, posting, "I've worked with Dave for years, and the man I know is not the caricature that's been painted of him. He deserves to tell his side without being dismissed as bitter or difficult." The metal community owes him that much respect. Younger metal musicians have also weighed in, with Trivium's Matt Heffy noting, "As someone who grew up worshipping both bands, it's sad to see this conflict reignited. But it's also important for the historical record to be accurate. Both bands shaped what metal became, and both Mustaine and Hetfield are legends who deserve proper recognition for their contributions." The generational divide among fans seems pronounced, with older fans often taking hardened positions, while younger metalheads express confusion about why reconciliation has proven so impossible. Social media analysis reveals the controversy has generated more online engagement than anything else in the metal world this year, with hundreds of thousands of posts debating minute details of 40-year-old songs and events. Music historian Martin Popoff observes, "What's fascinating is how passionate people remain about events from 4 decades ago. It speaks to how formative and important these bands were in creating not just music but identities for their fans. They weren't just creating thrash metal, they were creating tribes, and tribal loyalties run deep." Music industry veterans see the Mustaine-Hetfield conflict as emblematic of deeper issues in the business, particularly regarding how young bands handle creative credits. "What happened with Metallica and Dave was unfortunately common," explains former Megaforce Records executive Marcia Vlasic. "Young bands make handshake agreements about songwriting, then when money starts flowing, those informal arrangements fall apart." John Zazula, who signed Metallica to their first record deal before his passing in 2022, had previously addressed the context. These were teenagers making decisions that would affect the rest of their lives. There was no blueprint for thrash metal's success. They were creating it as they went. As the dust settles on this latest explosion, fans wonder if these metal titans will ever find peace. 40 years is a long time to carry anger, observes Kerry King. These two men fundamentally changed music, created genres, influenced generations, but they may never stand on stage together again. Some wounds cut too deep to heal even after all this time. Despite the animosity, Mustaine acknowledged Metallica's achievements in one revealing moment during his explosive interview. "They built something massive. I built something I'm proud of. We took different paths, but both bands matter historically. I just want the truth acknowledged before we're all gone from this world." Is that really too much to ask after 40 years? The honest recognition of what really happened and who really contributed what. I think I've earned that much. The implications of Mustaine's revelations extend beyond personal and business concerns to questions about metal's historical record. Music historians note that this dispute touches on the very foundations of thrash metal's origin story. The narratives around genre creation are always messy and contested, explains Dr. Rebecca Williams, who studies popular music history at UCLA. But they matter tremendously both to the participants and to our understanding of cultural evolution. What Mustaine is challenging isn't just his personal treatment, but the carefully constructed mythology that's been built around one of music's most influential bands. And mythologies once established are extraordinarily resistant to revision, regardless of evidence. With both Mustaine and Hetfield now in their 60s, fans increasingly wonder if this conflict will outlive its participants. There's something almost Shakespearean about the duration and intensity of this rivalry, reflects Kerry King. These guys created something revolutionary together, experienced a traumatic split, and have spent 40 years circling each other like planets locked in mutual orbit, unable to escape each other's gravity. I wonder if they realize how much they still define each other, even as they try to separate their legacies. Industry veterans who have worked with both bands note that the conflict has likely fueled creative excellence, even as it caused personal pain. Would Mustaine have driven himself to create Rust in Peace without that chip on his shoulder? Asks producer Andy Sneap. Would Metallica have pushed themselves to make Master of Puppets if they weren't aware of Megadeath gaining ground? The rivalry pushed both bands to heights they might not have reached otherwise. That's the tragic irony. These guys needed each other even as they tried to destroy each other. As both bands continue their respective journeys, fans can only hope that metal's longest-running feud might someday find resolution. Though given the latest developments, that seems unlikely. 40 years later, the riffs still roar, but the silence between them speaks even louder. Observes Kerry King. These two men forged something that changed music forever. The rest is just noise.